Got a fantastic conversation for you with Lou Lebentz. She is the author of Trauma Informed Practice, a guide for coaches and counselors. She also wrote 56 solutions for trauma healing. She's a real force of nature. We get into her early childhood, joining the rag trade, ultimately working on radio before having a psychotic episode, which started her own healing journey, which found her working at the world famous Priory Addiction Recovery Centre, where she developed an appreciation for trauma herself. She started looking at her own trauma, and now she's bringing that understanding to the world, training coaches, counsellors, rehab workers across the globe with her Voyage program. She's a fantastic individual, a wealth of knowledge. I really think you're going to enjoy this one.
I mean, I sometimes think, my God, how many years could I have saved or saved other people if I'd known about trauma earlier and even understood what it was?
Welcome to another episode of Being Human. Delighted to say I'm here with Lou Lebentz. Hello, Lou. Joining us from Hampshire. She's the author of 2 books, 56 Solutions to Healing Trauma and Trauma Informed Practice, an essential guide for coaches and counsellors. She's the founder of The Voyage, an online trauma recovery training program. She's a trauma clinician, a speaker. Lou, a very, very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you. And thank you for inviting me. And I'm delighted to be here and hope I'm going to be of service for the next however long that we've got.
I'm sure you will.
Good.
I'm sure you will.
That would be nice.
Okay. So where I love to start with guests is fill us a little bit in on your backstory and where did you grow up? How was little Lou as a child? Your beginnings in this world.
My beginnings in this world. Oh my goodness. How far back should I go?
All the way, Lou.
Okay. Well, the birth beginnings weren't that great. So, in terms of we were speaking a little bit earlier about, before we came live on air, about birth trauma, and I had rather a lot of it. So I think the needle that was stuck in my head on exit, because my blood didn't mix very well with my mum's and dad's didn't. So I was in an incubator the first few weeks of my life. And, knowing what I know now about pre-verbal trauma, et cetera, and being left on one's own as a young baby, when I got home, I was kind of fed up and up because I nearly died. So that was my first bit on the planet. I think it got a lot better. And I grew up mainly in Buckinghamshire and Berkshire. But I did grow up with, I had a few issues as a young child. So I had a very dodgy left lazy eye that went completely in. And various other things that happened to me before 10 kind of set me on the path, if you like, to doing what I do now, let's say, and to becoming really interested in trauma. So, but I was quite an ebullient, chatty young thing, and I particularly liked horses. And I know that about 11, I learned that stage was quite a good place for me. So I was Joseph at school, in Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat, and kind of loved it. And then went on to study drama for quite some years after that. So that's kind of a little bit of a mixture of my childhood.
Wow. And did you get the bug then? And you say you kept that, how long did you continue that?
I did get the bug until about 17. And so I was thinking I wanted to tread the boards and all the rest of it. And then my parents had a rather dastardly divorce around that age of late teenage. And my father was in the rag trade, the fashion industry. So I thought at 17, 18, okay, I won't go to RADA, I'll go into the rag trade. So I started working in fashion and spent my first, 7 or 8 years working for like the likes of Sir Philip Green. And for anybody old enough to listen, a company called Joe Bloggs Jeans.
Oh, yes. Yeah, I
Yeah.
remember. And
Yeah.
for international listeners, Philip Green is like a huge retail,
Yes.
fashion retail tycoon in the
Used
UK.
to terrify the life out of me. So I remember being, working in his jeans company. And whenever he hollered in the back room, us all kind of quaking in our boots, But yes, it was a very interesting early entry into the business fields. And then something happened to me at 24, 25, which was quite huge, that made me then change career direction. And I left the rag trade and ended up going into radio. So I worked for Capital Radio for many years in their marketing and events department, which was brilliant. And then I got nicked by Heart 106.2 to help set it up and run the marketing and events department there. So I was in radio for a while.
And what was the event at 24 or 25?
We might go back to that. So I was sectioned.
Oh.
I became sectioned. So I went with Joe Bloggs Jeans to a clothes show exhibition in Birmingham at the NEC. And it was, fashion show. And little beknownst to me, on the way back to London, I kind of started losing my mind. And about 3 days later, ended up with an ambulance being sent to section me, who put me into a kind of one of those old asylums in Epsom 30 years ago, where I had psychosis. I was psychotic. And I didn't realize at the time, but I found out, a year later, that somebody had spiked me at the clothes show exhibition. And, that's what led to the psychosis. But, in retrospect, some years later on, the psychosis was probably the most enlightening moment of my life and the most spiritual moment of my life. And I had a very profound time until I was sadly drugged out of it. I didn't want to be. So that was amazing. And, it really probably might have happened anyway, whether I'd been drugged or not, because it started to open me up to this belly full of kind of unresolved trauma from my childhood that I then unfortunately chose to ignore for quite some years later after that. So I kind of went into radio and, remembered some things of the psychosis, but not really looking at yet what had happened. So it had been an awakening and it had been a spiritual moment, but I think I fell asleep again for about another 5 or 6 years. And then I hit 30. And I started to think, I'm not sure whether rag trade or radio is really quite right for me. And I was working at Heart, but it kind of didn't feel like it had enough heart for me. And so I was really unsure what I wanted to do with my life. And then I got a call from my mum up a mountain in Italy, who was looking after, at the time, my stepfather, who had relapsed for a second time on alcohol. And he was a chronic alcoholic. And so I went out to help her. And then 3 years later, it was a long journey, returned to the UK and thought, what am I going to do now? I don't want to go back into radio. So I trained in kind of fitness to start with. And then I started doing NLP training, neuro-linguistic programming. I trained as a clinical hypnotherapist. And eventually, a year or so later, I ended up doing a 6 months training in addiction therapy. My stepfather had been a great pointer to that, and so had my earlier history. And then my first job, very luckily, was at the Priory at Roehampton. So about 34, 35, was my first kind of proper job in the therapy and mental health fields. And I ended up staying there for 10 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and on the addiction treatment unit for 7. So, addiction was my specialism to start with, eating disorders. And then, of course, I started to do all my own therapy and look at the psychosis and my own trauma. And then about 4 or 5 years into the Priory, I remember that somebody had come back from America. They'd been out in the States training, and they came back with what we called in those days a trauma egg. And a trauma egg was all about how you put your early childhood and experiences into an egg and described your relationship with your parents, etc. And it started to dawn on me that, oh my God, I'm working with all these people with addiction and eating disorders, but oh my God, they've all got trauma. Like what's underneath it is all trauma. And then I started to find out about the adverse childhood experiences scale, and I looked at my score on it and went, oh my God, I've got trauma. I'm not just a psychotic, or an addict. That there are reasons that I've been dysregulated, and my nervous system and that of my clients is so dysregulated that we need to soothe through other means. So that was, 15 years ago, maybe. And
well, that's fascinating. How long were you into your sort of therapeutic career before you had this realization about trauma?
Absolutely. And I look back now to those early clients and I go, oh my God. And what we actually used to do at the Priory is in the early days, we used to look at their life stories and go, you go and do the trauma egg because you've got trauma. Oh no, you haven't got enough trauma. So you go and do that workshop. And essentially we're saying to half the population then, you've got trauma and you've not got trauma. And now that makes me cringe thinking that we used to do that. But it also concerns me that there are so many other clinicians out there and people that don't know about trauma and that don't know what it is, like me, that were blind to it for years, even when they'd studied in it, because it's not in any of the trainings, Richard.
Yeah,
You don't still learn about trauma. Nothing is seen through a trauma lens. It might be an add-on or a day or a workshop if you train as a counselor or psychotherapist, but it's not the lens through which you view things. So, I mean, I just sometimes think, my God, how many years could I have saved or saved other people if I'd known about trauma earlier and even understood what it was?
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I completely, relate to what you're saying. I can just remember the first therapist I went to was not trauma informed, and we'll come to what that means. And I come out of the sessions and thought, oh well, I understand myself a bit better, but how is this going to actually help? I don't feel like I was getting to the root cause. And I was very lucky. I'm very early on when I first started kind of looking at all this. I read John Bradshaw's Homecoming.
Lovely.
And that's about, I mean, I don't agree with everything he says in that, but what he does obviously point to is the root cause of a lot of our dysregulation, as you put it, addiction and so on. And it's all about the early wounding, the early trauma. And so once I'd read that book, it put me on the path and recovery.
Yeah, we're very good, aren't we? Or we seem to be very good at dealing with the symptoms, but actually we don't get to what's underneath the symptoms. And I resonate too, because I mean, oh my God, the fire walking, the ashrams, the CBT, all the things that I spent a lot of time and money on trying to heal myself were never actually getting to the issue. They were just dealing with all this peripheral stuff. So you almost, because for me, not being able to put down alcohol or give up smoking or do any of these other things, you just then turn it in on yourself so much because you're not getting the information as to why you're doing these things in the first place.
Yeah.
It just doesn't add up.
And so what was your early, so you recognized the trauma was at the root cause. And then for yourself, what did you first start to discover in terms of your own background and identify as being traumatic? And what did you first start to work on, and how did you work on it? I'm interested in your first steps.
Okay. So I think my ACE score, which is Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale, which some people hate, and to be fair, they need to update it, and some of the language around it was fairly high. So my mother is a Barnardo's kid. So she was rescued by the NSPCC, and I think she was one of the first cases in the UK. And I've still got her Chronicle Gazette it was in, of her being in Chelmsford Crown's Court at like the age of 4 or 5, and her stepfather being fined for abusing her. And this was physical and emotional abuse, and she was taken away and she was put into Barnardo's and, fostered in, fostered out. And eventually she got taken in by a spinster in Frinton upon Sea. I don't know if you've ever been to Frinton upon
No.
Sea. It's a very curious seaside town in Essex, which, is lovely, but they didn't allow a pub or a chip shop in the village till about 10 years ago. So it's quintessentially Victorian. And my auntie, we called her auntie, who was the Victorian spinster that adopted my mum, said that when she came from all the foster homes and all the rest of it, she was very mute, so she couldn't speak for 6 months. And this auntie was a governess, so she was really good at dealing with children, and she obviously took her under her wing. But that was my mother's background, and she'd never done any work on her own trauma. And so what we know, not blaming, and we've got a brilliant relationship, is we over-enmeshed really, and her intergenerational trauma, a lot of what she went through, I then kind of collected on the other side. And then the other part in my family is there's quite a lot of addiction. So there's quite a lot of alcoholism down the family line and the genetics. And then sadly, I went through my own very early childhood trauma at the age of 4. So I was sexually abused, but by a female babysitter, so not by a male. So I think that sent me on the pathway at 4, and it was repetitive. That was my early wounding, really, and a bit of a lack of attachment or feeling safe in my family of origin. And then, other things got piled on the top of that.
And I'm curious, you mentioned the birth earlier. Was that something you identified early on, or did you not recognize that until later?
I didn't recognize any of it really until later, until I started really doing the work. And I mean, a lot of my work has been, therapeutic and somatic, but I have done a lot with EMDR. So eye movement, desensitization, reprocessing, which I know that quite a few people are talking about these days, which is a form of bilateral stimulation. So you either use tapping or eyes or auditory beeps, and you go back into the memory and the limiting belief, but not in a reliving way. And through the bilateral stimulation, it processes the memory from the body. So it's a powerful way of healing. And then other than therapy, lots of other different types of, healing that we try along the way have all culminated, I hope. Listen, I joke in that we're all on a journey of continuous becoming. So am I fully healed from every layer of my trauma yet? Probably not. But I'm in a lot better shape than I was 10 or 15, 20 years ago.
Right. And so you were starting to work with these different techniques. And what started to shift then for you in who you are being? What differences did you see?
Okay, so I always, with clients or anybody I train, I don't know whether you resonate with this, is I always say there's kind of three of us or three states. I mean, there's lots of different models, isn't there, or
Mm.
things out there. And I kind of say there's our adult present moment self, who I am in this moment, my real core authentic self. But we're not just our core authentic self, our present moment self. If only we were, all of us, I think, have an adapted self and we've got a
Right.
wounded self.
Yeah.
And they are like the angel and the devil, or whatever, the black and white, the all or nothings, the good, the bad, the whatever, on our shoulders. And the teenager, I know in coaching a lot, we kind of call them internal critics or saboteurs or etc. That part of us that tells us that we're defective or not good enough or unworthy. And then I believe that we all have a wounded child.
Mm.
Yes, you've got a free child and a fun-loving child and a playful child, but most of us, I don't think, escape childhood without some limiting belief or something going on that makes us feel not okay in some way.
Mm.
And so for me, it's about how much of the time that person or myself am I in my wounded self, and how much do I believe it still? How much am I in my adapted self, which is kind of criticizing, pushing away, defending, dissociating, or numbing? Am I using drugs or alcohol or binge eating or Netflix to keep away from my wounded self? Or am I kind and loving towards both parts of me, my teenager, who can sometimes be a bit stroppy and irritated with people? And am I loving towards that young 6 or 5 or 4-year-old part of me from my adult, or am I in them? And I
Right.
think the journey of our growth is that bit by bit by bit on the journey, we are able to become more from our adult centered, present moment self, be kind to our teenager and recognize when it's got a bit of a strop on or is trying to push stuff away that we need to look at, and be extra kind with that wounded pre-10-year-old and do the work on that wounded pre-10-year-old to reconnect with it. And I mean, probably people are listening to this going, oh my God, it's the therapist talking about inner children and inner child again. What a load of, but it's not what a load of. I've never met somebody that doesn't have an inner child. I don't care if they're a corporate executive or they're a CEO. They have got an inner child.
Right.
And I think the more that we can turn towards that part of us and unwound it, the more our adapted part softens and goes, oh, hold on, I haven't got anything to protect anymore. I haven't got to look after this part or push people away from it or worry about being vulnerable. The more they can step into their adult. And oh my God, don't we need in leadership positions and management positions now more people leading from their adult and less from their adapted and wounded parts?
Mm-hmm. Amen.
Amen to that. If
Yes.
only. Can we start with our government? And I promise I won't get political.
Yeah. No, but you're absolutely right. That defensiveness income. Oh no, she's not talking about the wounded child. Here we go. Right. That's where I was. Right. That is absolutely where I was. Right. All through my 20s, into my early 30s, it's all just out there somewhere. And I, of course, I've now recognised it. That was absolutely my defence. That was my way of giving myself a reason not to go anywhere near any of that buried pain.
Yeah.
And then, of course, once I started exploring it and started to heal some of it, the benefits were just enormous and sustained, and everything in my life just got incrementally better the more of that work I did. So I kept doing more of that work.
I know. But it's getting people over the hurdle, isn't it? Initially, to actually go towards the pain, because they don't want to go towards the feelings. They don't want to feel what's in the body. They'd rather cut off from the body, not go there, and then walk around from kind of the neck up, pretending everything's okay.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's how I was leading my life up until I started this work. And of course, many people lead their entire lives, or perhaps even most people live their entire lives in some form of that, of that state, a sort of permanent denial state. Which and many people have perfectly good lives. It's not like it's a judgment against people who choose to live that way, but that is a different path available.
I'm gonna come up with something that's might sound a bit judgmental to that. So they might not have it affect their lives as much, but unless we are coming from our adult and our heart-centered space, the more we're coming from our adapted. And I think because it's got to protect something, it's got to defend or dissociate or push away. So I think the more that we're coming from that, the more that we're seeing out there in the world, this kind of divisiveness, this division, this anger, this irritation. We're not seeing in positions of power and authority enough people that are coming from their heart-centered adult, who have done enough work on themselves not to be activated, triggered, incandescent. And so I think it's kind of upon all of us now to start to, as humanity, start to do that work on slightly softening, on slightly going towards what each of us carry. Because if we do that individually, it's building into the collective then, isn't it?
Yeah. And
So
I think
it's like healing the world then individually, because we're collectively then doing it.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think whenever one person takes one step towards it and then reports the benefits to other people, it sends a signal out to everyone else. A, it's okay to do it, and B, that there's benefits from doing it. Yeah. So you started doing this work on yourself, as you say. You then became able to soften your adaptive self. You were able to heal your wounded self, come more into your adult self. And then what happens? Yeah, how does your life change as you find yourself doing it?
Like you said, it's completely changes. I mean, 20 years ago, I was downing, 40 Benson and Hedges a day and a bottle of Pinot Grigio and thinking it was normal, and I haven't now had any alcohol for 17 years, and I've certainly not smoked the same. So I don't self-soothe anymore, but much more than that is I can kind of go towards everything. As you've noticed, I can speak about anything that's happened to my life without shame or from a stage, and be completely transparent, which is refreshing. And I had a terrible, even when I worked at the beginning at the Priory, but certainly at Capital Radio and Heart, I had a terrible fear of public speaking. I was so cut off from my child and so shamed that I couldn't speak in a room, of like 4 or 5 people. I lost my voice. I found it so difficult. And I think through the process of recovery, and I think we're all on a journey of recovery of some sort, recovering something. A lot of the profound work for me was in recovering my voice. I had no voice. I was completely codependent. I would appease everybody and never say boo to a goose. And that was exhausting. Exhausting. So I think that was a big part of doing the healing work, was that I was able to start to feel a lot less shame about who I was and the journey that I'd been on.
Right. Yeah. And how did you then shift in terms of how you were working with clients as you were going, on this journey yourself?
I think it deepens anyway, the work. I think the more work we do on ourselves, it's a bit like layers, isn't it? It's a bit like the ocean, and I liken everything, of course, to a voyage, but it is a bit like, we dive down deeper and deeper, we get stronger in our arms and our legs, and we're able to hold more oxygen and stay for longer. And I think because our nervous systems get more regulated, we're in what I call, or polyvagal would call, ventral vagal, which is our adult self and our flow and all the rest of it, that we are then safer containers and vessels to be around with another human being. Because I think that they can sense that we can dive down to the depths within our own system and the emotions and the feelings and the memories, and not be scared to go there with them.
Right.
So it kind of culminates in a lot more depth work and a lot more being able to hold somebody in their own depths and their own somatic system and their own nervous system without going. And I know that I have been with some therapists in the past that, the moment you get emotional, it's like, oh, should we go back up to the surface? Let's go up to the surface now. Which is, you don't want to be doing that.
Yeah, no.
Because you're kind of saying to somebody again, which is very much often what we got in childhood anyway, which is, don't be with your feelings. Your feelings are too much. Your feelings aren't acceptable. Do you know what I mean? You're re-traumatizing them almost by not being able to contain it with them.
Yeah, no, I completely resonate with it. It made me smile because I think I've shared this on the podcast before, but I remember having craniosacral massage once with this therapist, and she was working in the sort of base of my skull and around that top area, and I started to regress into some of the birth stuff, and I started having these convulsive movements on the table, and she's like, "Okay, I think that's us done."
Oh my goodness!
And she just, as you said, she just hadn't been there herself. She wasn't able to hold the anxiety, as it was bringing up a lot of very primal.
That's really interesting because the craniosacral guy that I had, who was amazing, and that's such an important piece of work. That can be such a powerful piece of work. And even EMDR and all the release type stuff is the body just wants to complete the action. So you let the body, like in EMDR, people run, people shake, they jerk, their arms and legs start going, like, go, let the body do it. It's normal. Just breathe.
Weird yourself to healing, right?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry that happened. Yeah.
No, but it just...
Yeah. Hopefully she's not still doing it now.
I mean, yeah. Maybe.
So, whoever's listening, stay with it and keep breathing and be with somebody who can co-regulate that space. It's all about the co-regulatory other sometimes, because we often as children haven't been co-regulated with in our early nervous system. So we don't learn how to self-regulate. We can't regulate our own emotional system. So a lot of the work of therapy and coaching, I would say, is about being that co-regulatory other.
Yeah, exactly. And having that, you use it, hold it in space. I love that idea, right? Somebody who can be with me whilst I explore these painful places or indeed joyful places. I mean, that's part of this, is that certainly in my experience, I've learned to express joy, feel joy in a way that I couldn't before. I was capable of feeling high. I wasn't capable of feeling joy.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because I think people think when they shut off or they dissociate or they disconnect from the body in some way, that they just disconnect from the uncomfortable feelings.
Right.
But unfortunately, you're shutting down all the others as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And then well, in my case, I'd substitute getting high for feeling joy, or not consciously, of course.
Yeah. Makes total sense.
Yeah, or the adrenaline buzz,
Yeah.
which is somehow positive to the system, but not the same.
Yeah.
Connected joy. Yeah. So you're able to work much more at depth with your clients, and this is still at the Priory, right? Is this towards the tail end of your time at the Priory?
This is towards the tail end. And then I think I did about 10 years in private practice, and I still do see the odd client, but I have now moved more into the speaking training world. So, yeah. So as my practice has deepened, and I suppose I have learned more and access more, it's then opened up other doorways out of the one-to-one world to, share more widely, I suppose, to groups rather than just to individuals.
Right. Yeah, and that brings us on to your trauma-informed practice. So let's talk a little bit about that. What do you mean by trauma-informed practice, and what are some of the core elements of it, and how you help people?
So what is trauma-informed? It's interesting, isn't it? Because it's a word that's bandied about a lot at the moment. You kind of see it everywhere, and I think there are different levels of it, and there are different layers to it. Because I think it's a journey, like all journeys. So I think we start by being trauma aware. Actually, what is trauma, and then we go on to being trauma sensitive, and then maybe we go on deeper to being trauma informed, because that feels like you really know quite a lot about trauma at that point. And then you're trauma responsive, which is all of your procedures, they're all coming through the lens of trauma, and not many people are there, or corporations or organizations. So trauma aware, which is the first one, is kind of aware what trauma is, because most people think that trauma is like a big one-off event, or something that is easily describable as traumatic, but that's not what trauma is. So trauma is about what happens inside of you. It's not an event. So it's what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you, as Gabor Mate says. So it's your individual response to something that was overwhelming to your nervous system. But it's not just what happened to the nervous system or you. It's also, because that means it's something that has to happen. It's also something that didn't happen. So it's the missing of something. It's the absence of something. And very often people come to me and they go, well, I haven't got trauma. I haven't been in, a car accident or a war or a rape or something that's overtly trauma, but they've grown up in a family system where nobody was really there emotionally. They were neglected. They didn't feel attuned to or mirrored by their parents, or they felt unsafe in some way. That is trauma.
Yeah.
So you've got to kind of understand what trauma is. And then you've got to understand, I think, that it can be in your lifetime, in your birth, in your early years. What was there that felt unsafe? What wasn't there? What was the absence of things? And then you go on to, unfortunately, the parental story. What was your mum or dad's trauma? What had they not worked through? What were the unnarrated aspects of their own life story that they hadn't worked out? What were their beliefs? What were their fears? Because unfortunately, we know that parents can introject their own material into their children. And then we got to look at the intergenerational. So I call it the soup that we grew up in. So the soup that we grew up in is our grandparents and the system. but it's the environment, it's the schooling, it's the friends, it's the teachers, it's the poverty or wealth, the racism or the sexism or the homophobia or the whatever phobia, phobic, the lens of cultural, societal issues that is trauma. And we are growing up, and kids these days, young people, are growing up in a more traumagenic society. It is. There's more happening in the world for them now in terms of trauma than there was when I was a kid.
Right.
So I
in
think,
the sense of,
well, in the sense of, the instability of the world, the speed of technology, the wars, the lack of safety, the global pandemics, the economic environment, the stress that parents are under, the cost of living. I mean, if you accumulate all of that together, social media, if I haven't said that already, and I suppose political more instability even than there was. I mean, I'm not going to make any jokes about Donald Trump, but that it's a different world than it was 10 or 20 years ago. And we've got climate crisis. So and we're growing up with kids now who, if you look at the housing situation in the UK, what are they thinking about their future? So I
yeah,
do think it's tougher for them, if I'm honest. And just the speed of everything. I mean, I don't
yeah,
know how you cope with it, but I'm like, God, I'm 57. I'm like, was it Messenger, WhatsApp, this, that, email? Who's coming at me at what? Like, I can't remember. It's so fast. And
yeah,
that doesn't help a nervous system or anybody's nervous system that are finding it hard to rest and digest, to go into parasympathetic mode. We are spending so much of our lives at the moment in sympathetic activation up here, and that's not healthy for us as a species either.
right.
So is that a bit too doom and
No,
gloom?
no. I mean, I guess we could try and get into some kind of historical analysis over which period was, but I think more or less, traumagenic. It's probably not
Yeah, I
not particularly useful. But I would
yeah,
certainly agree that there are enormous stresses on
pressures.
families and kids in ways that haven't existed before, and we certainly see in the stats, levels of depression, especially amongst females, levels of suicidality amongst males. Right, there are plenty of pointers that, at least,
Yeah,
certainly right now in history, uh, yeah, overall levels of health
yeah.
aren't as good as they have been in other periods of history. Right.
No, and I think, technological stuff has added to that, but I just think the pace of life feels like it's speeded up so much that, we don't have the time to slow down and connect anymore. And we are social beings. We need to connect and be in nature and be in relationship and community with each other to be well.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah. So we've got to counteract all of that, and we've got to try and understand what trauma is, I think, to be able to see mental health, which I've always thought, mental health is a bit of a misnomer, because what does it really mean? Like, what is mental? Like, point to mental. Don't worry.
Yeah.
You know, what what is mind, and how do we split the two? Because if mental is mind, what about the body? And then what about the spiritual nature of us too? Are we just saying that we're all mind and mental? So I don't really like the term mental health.
I'm completely with you on that. It seems like the problem is in the definition. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. So I see, and some of my contemporaries get very upset with this, and certain realms of the mental health profession do not like this, but I do see all mental health conditions through the lens of trauma, which basically means a dysregulated nervous system, unable to self-regulate. And then I think that's why we get all of these conditions that then appear afterwards, because our body mind is not in sync anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that. I mean, name a condition that doesn't have its root in trauma, right? I mean, it's maybe 1%. I mean, it's yeah.
That is quite unpopular, though. That's quite an unpopular way of looking at things because, for lots of reasons, if you've got a diagnosis, yes, it can be helpful for some people. And yes, medication, I'm not anti-medication. It can be helpful at certain points at the journey. But going back to what we were talking about at the start, we have to get to the cause and not keep looking at the symptoms.
Yeah, I agree. It's that's the first base.
Yeah.
For me, with alcoholism, the first step was accepting I was an alcoholic, was getting into 12-step rooms. But I'm so grateful that I started to look at, well, what had me be an alcoholic in the first place? And once I opened that inquiry, I got quite quickly to the trauma.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
it's just the word has got a PR problem. We've got a PR problem with the word trauma. People don't like the word. And, if you ever mention it in a corporate setting, it's like trauma.
Well, that's part of the mission of this podcast, is to have this conversation be part of the mainstream. And it's interesting, I saw Stephen Bartlett posting on LinkedIn, and he had a trauma expert on his show. And the post just previewing this guy coming on his show got 1,000 likes.
Wow.
So I'm like, okay.
Yeah. Amazing.
The grounds are shifting. And of course, Gabor Mate has now got an enormously high profile. So definitely things are changing. But you're right. I think that in terms of people overtly talking about trauma and people overtly talking about how trauma impacts our behaviors as adults in the workplace and elsewhere, it's growing, but it's still certainly not a mainstream conversation.
Yeah, not yet, but I'm hoping it will be, because if we look at it as trauma just really equals dysregulated nervous system, where we're either going into sympathetic activation too much, and I call that like the adapted gets activated and irritated and anxious and etc., or we're going into dorsal vagal kind of shutdown, which is more the wounded, depressed, low, lethargic, flat. We've just got no window of tolerance anymore in the middle. We're not able to be regulated in our bodies because we've shut down our feelings in some way.
Yeah.
So it's titrating somebody very slowly and gently back into the body so that they can start to feel things again slowly and start to swim.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I think the other thing, and I had this because I had Peter Levine on the show. So
one of the greats. I feel blessed to even be in the same studio room as Peter.
But he also used this term titrate, right? Just allow ourselves to experience some of that pain, and I agree with him, right? And certainly in my own experience, I had to in those early days, just a little bit of time. But then very quickly, I was like, no, I'm kind of all in on this. I'm going to go, and even if it has me on my back for a day, even if it totally sort of immobilizes me and has me be unable to operate in the world, I'm prepared to take that on. And so I did, and as a result, fully healed certain traumas. And I think there's perhaps a point of difference there between Peter and I, because Peter's like, well, no, we just sort of need to feel enough, and perhaps we can accept we'll never fully heal from certain traumas, but just doing some of that work is going to give us great benefit. And I was like, yeah, that's all true. And we don't have to stop there, right? I wonder what your perspective is there.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? So a lot of things are coming up for me as you say that. And, no doubt some of the deeper treasure chests, I call them, or things at the bottom of the ocean need a lot of diving down into to get full resolution, whatever that full resolution is. But I'm also a great believer that we have to be able to swim, because we're not pushing anybody off the edge of the boat and just going swim, swim, swim. Oh, you're drowning. Oh, okay. Because for some people, you can flood the system too much.
Right.
So you don't want to flood the system too much. You want to. So that's really what titration and pendulation do. They don't want the somatic to come up. Because if you think some people, not you, they've stood on dry land for years and they've never even dipped their toe in the water. And suddenly you're going, well, hey, off the back of the boat, go on, get on with it. And you and I might be more up for it. And I'm sure we'd share a few stories over, a sparkling water one day. But lots of people need that dipping in, dipping out, dipping a bit further in, dipping out, dipping even further in, so that they're not so scared of the ocean. And I guess it's whether your adult is really fully online or is really like gung-ho and I'm going to look after those wounded parts of me, whatever comes up, I can deal with it. Because what we don't want to do is we don't want to lose the adult. We don't want somebody to fall into a 6-year-old or a 4-year-old or a pre-verbal state and they've got no access because they've been dropped into it too quickly to their adult self, who's going to go, it's all right, little 4-year-old. I know you haven't quite healed all of that today, but we'll go back to it tomorrow. So you've got to kind of be mindful with people. And this is my, sometimes my worry with psychedelics, is that I think they're great. And I think that they are going to make a difference to a lot of people's journey and speed things up somewhat. But I would never do them at the beginning of somebody's journey.
Right.
I would pretty much make sure that they are embodied enough and they can sensate into their uncomfortable feelings enough before I'd say, go off and do a little journey.
Right. Yeah.
Because again, we've got to be able to contain that stuff that comes up.
Yes. No, that sounds very wise to me.
Yeah.
And I didn't use any psychedelic all the way through. And before we came on, as we talked about how you've got this book, 56 Solutions to Healing Trauma, and I appreciated that because there are, as like I said, I think there are as many ways to heal as there are human beings. And but what I found was when people describing their psychedelic experiences was, that's exactly what I experienced when I was doing my very deep work with primal therapy. And it's just whatever enables us to not fully open up, to open up, and the extent to which we open up and allow ourselves to go there is the extent to which we'll heal.
I agree. And also to try and think that it is a journey as well. That's why I've called the voyage, because sometimes we think, I just want to get to the dream destination. Like, why can't I be there now? And it's funny, going back to me at 24, that psychosis that felt like a spiritual awakening. And the funny bit of that for anybody that's watched my TEDx is in my spiritual awakening, I don't know whether you know this bit or you've seen it, but I was on stage with Oprah Winfrey and the Dalai Lama. Great. I was like, great, this is just wonderful. And then obviously got brought back down with pretty heavy psychiatric meds and was like, couldn't walk or talk for a few weeks. But it's very interesting how 30 years later, I can see how the journey has unfolded at just the right pace for my nervous system without the lid blowing off. So
Right.
yeah, it feels like I've come up the other side. I mean, I'm not on stage with Oprah Winfrey and the Dalai Lama, but that bit hasn't come true. But the bit that's come true is at least now I can stand on a bloody stage and tell my story a bit, whereas 20 years ago and maybe even 10, I wouldn't have been able to. So I think we titrate and we come into our full adult authentic self at maybe just the right time.
Yeah.
But I don't think we can be chasing it. Oh, I'm going to be happy when I get there, because it's like it's enjoying the journey, isn't it? And the steps
Yeah.
and the voyage.
Yeah, exactly. And although I've now left the rooms, one thing I really appreciate from when I was in the step rooms is this phrase that's always stuck with me. It takes 10 years to get your marbles back and another 10 years to learn how to play with them. And
I haven't heard that phrase before.
Right, but what it really helped with, because I heard that so early, was, okay, Richard, you've got to think about your recovery in terms of not months, not weeks, not decades, right? Think decades. And so it just really helped sort of set expectations in terms of my own recovery.
Yeah. Because I think we're all recovering that unadulterated sense of ourselves and who we would have been if we hadn't had those impressions to our identity and our nervous system and those beliefs and those things that have stopped us being all that we can be, right, along the way.
Yeah.
Maybe that's what we're recovering.
Yes. I think that you put it well. So let's talk. Well, hang on. We started with your trauma, but we got to trauma aware, and then we took a bit of a tangent.
We did.
And then we had trauma sensitive, trauma informed, and then trauma responsive. So should we just complete the?
Yes. So I for example, I run a training on trauma sensitive, and that's 12 weeks. But my trauma-informed training is a year in length, and it's 4 videos a month, and it's 4 hours a month of calls and practicals, because I think you need that long as a clinician or coach to really become trauma-informed within your own system, so that you teach out the things that you need to know about, which is kind of things like the neurobiology of trauma, how that impacts the brain, how that impacts sensory processing and development, how that impacts dissociation and our integration skills and all the rest of it. And I also think with trauma, we need to start understanding parts models, which is here's the adult, here's the adapted, and here's the wounded. And we need to stop using the I for everything, because the I is not the I for everything. The I is my adult self, but the I is not my wounded part or my adapted part. My wounded part is my historical part, and so is my adapted, but they're not my I. That's not who I am.
Right.
So things like that, and starting to see mental health and all the rest of it through a trauma and nervous system lens has to be the way that we're going, really. And then trauma responsive is we set our policies and our procedures up coming from a lens of, the nervous system and what people need to operate in their adult and at ventral vagal. And they need safety primarily. This whole thing of psychological safety is absolutely true, because they're going to be being activated at work into their adapted and wounded parts. And if I've got a manager that's not aware of that, they're not coming through a trauma-informed lens, really, and understanding that person in front of them in the same way. You're just going to think they're being difficult or being sulky or a bit sullen and shut down.
Yeah. Yeah. And as you say that, well, I think back all of the times in my own professional life where I've been triggered and activated and bounced off the people around me, completely unconscious of, what's going on for me. And of course, the people around me aren't informed either. And so you get these shit shows of meetings, which is just everybody triggering everybody else.
And then nobody's in their adult, and then you don't get anywhere. So I wonder how much kind of untreated trauma costs the economy, really.
That would be a fantastic calculation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is trying to embed some of those philosophies and training into, at least human resources areas, if not, senior leadership, really.
Well, I think it has to be senior leadership in the end. Yeah. Because, I had somebody on the podcast recently who's a CEO, and he took all of the culture work out of HR, and the point he made was HR got so much to deal with anyway, right? We need to give it special focus, and he had that group report to him as CEO, right?
Yeah.
And this for me would fall in that bracket of it's got to really, for it to be meaningful in the culture, it's got to come from the top.
But then if it comes from the top, we need CEOs who are willing to do the inner work and go towards their own waves and be on their own voyage of integrating their own limiting beliefs, their own childhood, their own somatic work.
Yeah. And I have hope that this will be seen as a core aspect of leadership as we go forward.
I agree.
Yeah. That's going to happen. And one of the things that what I noticed working out in the business world during the lockdown was that I had from a couple of people saying that they've been having to look at their managers because some of them weren't able to be effective during the pandemic because they were dealing with a lot more in terms of health issues. And I hesitate to use the mental health. I hate the term, but mental health issues. Some just weren't cut out to deal with it. And I thought at the time, well, from a trauma perspective, these people are already dysregulated, and now the environment they're in is going to bring up all kinds of stuff. They're having to potentially spend a lot more time with their family. There's all kind of factors which existed during that lockdown period. They're not able to get out into nature and regulate in that sense. So, you are going to be dealing with a lot more stuff as a manager. And if you were more trauma aware, you would have been able to deal with it more effectively.
Yeah. I mean, I just think that the pandemic was the kind of perfect storm, if you like, in that it triggered everybody's fear of more even unsafety out there. Then our connection to others, which is a way that we regulate, is unsafe. So double whammy. Then we've got to slow down as a species and be with ourselves. And I think our nervous system can take so many stacks, right? So it's stack. And then COVID was like the stack of the too much on top of everything else. And then the system just goes, oh my God, I'm either going to fight, which some people did, or I'm going to flight, or I'm just going to freeze, or I'm going to flop and just submit and duvet dive. Or the other survival response, we've got two more, is friend. So just be nice to everybody and try and befriend and people please. Or we attach, we try and attach. So there were a lot of freezers and floppers going on.
Yeah.
The system was just like, and I don't know whether you've noticed, but I have noticed that there were more irritation, more fighters about over COVID. There felt like there was a bit more road rage, since. I don't know.
I was since then, yeah, possibly.
Yeah,
Yeah, certainly during. Yeah.
because I think we're still dealing with those nervous systems, some of which haven't come back yet to a window of tolerance.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think all of that pales into what most people experience as kids, right? Because the major traumas in people, yes, that exacerbated the situation. It took away from some of the factors people use to help regulate them. But ultimately, it was the childhood experience. And I know that myself because I went through it all and I really didn't get particularly affected by it. I mean, I had a great time during, that may be to some people, but I was like, oh, great, I get to spend more time at home, more time with my kids.
Yeah.
I didn't buy into a lot of the fear mongering in the media, but I don't think I would have had that experience of lockdown had I not done all of that work on my childhood stuff, because it wasn't triggering me into old stuff, because I dealt with virtually all of my old stuff.
Yeah.
So I could take it all with a bit of a pinch of salt.
Yeah, exactly. Because you've got a wide window of tolerance.
Mm.
So much less now knocks you out into hyper arousal or hypo arousal. You can just kind of expand that window. And that is the beauty of doing the work. Yeah,
exactly. So I think back, if I'd have been through that in my 20s, my drinking would have skyrocketed, I'm sure. There'd have been all kinds of
me too.
Dysfunctional ways I would have dealt with that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we've talked about, we've talked about this voyage and how you help people to become trauma informed and then ultimately trauma responsive, and whether that's coaches or therapists or counselors.
I don't know whether I've said what the phases are of that voyage, and I liken it to 3 phases on a voyage for many of us. And so the first phase, if you like, of the voyage is to land in the sand.
Right.
So the first phase is to give people the right information to be able to expand their mind. So I start really with the mind or the brain, whatever mind is, and the informational part of it, so that they understand what's going on for them from a kind of neurobiological, nervous system, polyvagal informed place, and what the parts are and who their adult is. And that kind of grounds them. And then once they've got all that, we go swimming in the sea, of course, which is more of the integration phase. And I call it befriending the body.
Right.
So we come into the waves, we start to dive down, we start to get used to swimming and swimming well. We open the treasure chest, we look at the beliefs, we look at the things that are dysregulating the water, and just get somebody okay riding the boat or swimming in the sea and putting down any unhelpful coping strategies.
Yeah.
And I leave it till they've got some resources first before I take the stuff away. And then the third phase is like the inspiration bit, really. I call it soar in the sky. So it's like big picture bird's eye view. So that's got things like the vision in there, because I'm a great believer in vision. We might not have our vision or our mission or our calling at the beginning of our journey. It might come later, but sometimes we all need a good enough reason to do the work.
Yes. Yeah.
So we keep coming up to sky, if you like, to see the journey, the big picture. And then sky is partly about the community that we've got around us too, which is important on the voyage, the people, our supporters. And it's also about what's my mission or purpose, or where am I going? Am I in the right job for me? Am I doing what I love? Am I on the right voyage? Am I even on the right boat? And then sky for me is looking at all the things that we are victorious at, all the
Love it.
things that we're great at. You know, sometimes therapy, I think, gets a bad rap because it's, you know, if you look at Freudian and old school therapy, it looks at just the past and it looks at what's not working. But actually, I think we're coming much more from a world of therapy and coaching merging. So we're looking at actually, what are you really brilliant at already? What are you doing so well? How do we build that resilience, that flow, that resourcing into your system? And how do we add all of that together in a kind of mind, body, dare I even say the word spiritual kind of perspective? Because I think that's what the human journey is.
Yeah. And I love what you've said there, especially the coaching and therapy coming together. I wrote an article a while back saying we need to lose the distinction between coaching and therapy, and got quite a lot of heat for it. But
Yeah.
I absolutely believe that. You know, it's all of us, right? What motivates us to do all the work, as you said, it's because we want a beautiful life. We're creative beings with a vision who wants to have impact in the world. We don't just want to heal, right? It's all of it, all together.
Now, we want to create a better world and a better life for other people and for other people that come after us and our children or nieces, nephews, whoever else. We've got to be doing this for something, right?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, and just as you say that, I just think immediately of I've got no greater motivator than my kids right now. I've got young kids. And you talked about earlier that the stress is stacking, and occasionally, I do. Yeah, I mean, no matter how much work you do, there's for me at least, no matter how much work I've done, I've always got an edge, and there are moments where I will snap,
Totally.
and then, but I'm immediately like, okay, right, there's something to heal there, Richard. There's something to heal.
No, we're not perfect, Richard. We're not perfect, are we? You know, we sometimes get activated into our adapted or our wounded, no matter how much work that we've done. But what I think changes, and I think this is for us and hopefully for other managers and leaders who do the work, I think what it enables us to do is when we rupture or when we are activated, we go back and we do the repair.
Yeah.
You know, it's the repair. If all of us were able to repair in relationships, oh my God, wouldn't the world be a different place?
Yeah. And especially with kids. I mean, I think people in general, perhaps, you know, that we are forgiving beings. If I go back to my kid, hey, listen, that was on me. I'm sorry. I snapped. Yeah. Can we have a hug? Right. Or whatever. And that you're absolutely right. That becomes much easier because it's so quick for me to identify. Okay, I got caught. I got it. You know, it becomes much easier for me to own it. Whereas,
rupture and repair.
Very important, and you can easily see how that would happen in in a management context. Hey, I snapped in that meeting. Actually, it was XYZ. I was in my adaptive, or I was triggered, or whatever the nomenclature is. But we could then own it, repair, move on.
Exactly.
And just, of course, what I see a lot in businesses is sometimes, decades old patterns of like resentment and this that person, Sally can't speak to Mark anymore, and Philip had a fallout, 5 years ago, and so those departments aren't. It's like it's all there. But people don't have the tools to do the self-reflection initially to figure out, I got to. And secondly, then to come into that repair with somebody else.
I think you need a pretty resourced adult to be able to do that repair work, because otherwise it's almost like the ego won't allow us to go there to even say sorry.
Yeah.
It's either too defended or it's too destabilized, that to do something like that, to take that vulnerability, because you do need, Brené Brown's brilliant at this, isn't she? But, that level of kind of owning our own responsibility sometimes is really hard for people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'd say all the time. It's hard. But it becomes, it's like, I just become, certainly in my own experience, I just become more adept. You talked about swimming. I can just swim more easily. It's never easy to swim against the current, right? But you just get better at doing it. And sometimes you say you are swimming against your own ego, who doesn't want you to say sorry or accept that, there's potentially that twinge of guilt that comes with owning, having acted out.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And those are and so you're finding now that you're working across a broad range of professions with your work, or where do you find this?
At the moment, really, the voyage is still in its inception, I would say. So I've got this year-long program for coaches and counsellors and clinicians, and I've got a shorter one, 12-week, just launching in April. But I'm also taking the voyage out to treatment centres and rehabs and training them and their staff. So I'm going to South Africa on Saturday.
Oh, wow.
And I've got a voyage experience, which is, I piloted it in Los Angeles a couple of months ago to some American coaches. And it was amazing. We did kind of 3 days of lots of guided visualizations and music and taking people through the voyage. And it was just, it really works as a 3-day kind of experiential. So much more to come. But I think how I've written it and the 12 waves and the phases could be, it could be utilized in so many different situations, Richard. It could be the voyage for teenagers and, it could be taught to schools, or it could be the voyage for corporates, and it could be taught within a business and get everybody onto the voyage so they're all understanding this stuff, because it teaches the essence of how to be more human, really.
Yeah.
And how to own our stuff and be more regulated, but it still holds that vision, that dream, that ultimate goal of where the business is going. But the business can only get there, as you and I both know, if all the moving parts, which are the crew members on the blooming ship, are all rowing in the same direction. Because if they're all going off at different tangents and that one's not speaking to that one, they're never going to be aligned to get to the blooming vision anyway.
Yeah. And that's why it's a beautiful vision you've got with the voyage, and where it really aligns with what I see as being possible for the world, where we have policemen and, and teachers and managers and, firemen and and just everyone, trained, aware.
Yeah. Well, if you know anybody with a few quid who wants to help me set the mission up a bit more, please let me know, because, I've started with coaches and counsellors because I wanted to build a tribe of people already trained in the voyage. But really the dream for me, if I'm honest, is I've worked in private treatment for so long with people that do have the funds for therapy. And I know my own healing journey, all of my money went into my own healing journey. And I know that there are so many people out there that would benefit from a program like this, and like waiting lists as long as our arms of people that are waiting for help. And I just think, oh my God, if one day I could get it for 97 quid a month, or have the government part sponsor it or something, it would be an affordable, accessible program that people could do.
Yeah.
And so that's the dream, really. That is the ultimate dream.
To have this accessible to everyone.
Yeah. But out of small acorns, eh?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Well,
the
also
dream destination. I just got to let go of my own, like, can we not get there a bit quicker, please, now?
right. Yeah. I can relate.
Yeah.
But presumably right now you've got cohorts helping you refine this material and, you're working on it all the time.
Yeah. Just like to work on it even more of the time and have more people working on it one day. But, you never know. Somebody might be listening.
Well, have you got any colleagues back in your radio days who could get you on their shows?
Yeah.
Word out.
Yeah. Need the word out there. Definitely. And thank you for your help in doing that. And it's been a fun, hour and 20 minutes so far. Thank you.
Yeah, it's been great.
Yeah.
I really
And for
enjoyed
anybody
it.
that's still with us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, we get my audience are great listeners. They love listening. Yeah, some of our longest episodes are also the most popular. So.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
No, this has been really fun. So we'll put your links to. Well, I know that you can get the ebook Trauma Informed Practice on your website.
Yes.
The 56 solutions to healing trauma, is that available again on your website, or is that an Amazon book, or has?
Yeah, I'll send you the links to that. So maybe, I don't know whether you can put them underneath. Can you?
Yeah, we'll definitely put that in the show notes. And people can get to the voyage from there as well, right?
Yeah, it's all on the voyageacademy.com. So
thevoyageacademy.com,
yeah. So the year-long, the light dive, there isn't anything up for corporates or anything yet. There is something up for clinics and rehabs because I'm already doing that. But yes, open to all offers.
Yeah.
And likewise, if anything that I've said is helpful, or somebody wants to reach out or ask me something, that's absolutely fine too.
Brilliant. And you're also available to speak, aren't you, on this topic?
I am. I would really love to do more speaking. I really would. I haven't ever pushed that side of it yet, but I would like to get out there and speak even more. And we are thinking about doing more voyage experiences, the 3-day seminars. Currently, there's plans for potentially Dubai and Cape Town. Don't know how wide your audience goes, but I would love to do one in London.
We were the number one business podcast in Liechtenstein.
Oh, wow. That's interesting. Okay.
That is interesting.
Yeah, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yes. An invitation to Liechtenstein. Thank you.
I'm sure we've got a few listeners in Dubai, etc.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay.
So,
we'll put the link out.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Thank you. Lovely to meet you, and hopefully keep in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. We will.